Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. In today's episode, I speak with Michael Smith, who's co-founder of SaveSmallBusiness.ca. This is a group that recently started based on COVID's impacts to small businesses. They're working a lot to help influence some of the federal and provincial government policy when it comes to supports for small businesses. So stay tuned as I talk to Michael about what they're doing. Hey, Michael, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Leanne. Thanks for having me on.
I saw you started a group called Save Small Business. So I'm curious if you can just talk a little bit about how it started, why you started it, and what's happening.
Sure. Well, like many Canadians and fellow small business owners, I was really in mid-March trying to make sense of everything. And I was doing a fair amount of reading and trying to just analyze and determine how for myself in my own consulting and advisory work as well, very empathetic for many friends and family that are small business owners, what was a pathway forward where I could pivot and contribute to the immediate crisis response, particularly leveraging the economic front line to complement obviously a lot that's been happening on the health front. So really in those initial days of conversation, I spoke to a few people, and ultimately within a 24-hour period, we decided to create SaveSmallBusiness.ca as a website with a petition for small business owners to join us in asking for the federal government to do more to support small business. And during that initial outreach, we invited small businesses to share their stories. And within 24 hours, we had 2,500 small businesses join us. And now, a little less than a month later, we're at 35,000 across Canada, coast to coast to coast.
Wow, that's fantastic. I know partly what you guys did, you benchmarked Canada, what Canada was doing, and looked at some other countries as far as what they were doing. So can you comment on some of the things you found out, how we fare based on some other countries you looked at?
Yeah, so part of what our team did to provide credible recommendations to the federal government was to really look at a variety of countries, the US, the UK, Denmark, and France, as well as Australia. And really what we saw in the initial days, the initial weeks of the response from the Canadian federal government was similar things that other countries are doing. But there were a variety of things beyond wage subsidies, beyond loans, that other countries have been doing to support small business, particularly to deal with the fixed costs that many small local businesses have. So that would include rent support. In addition, looking at property taxes and other grants or programs that would really help the majority of our small businesses to get through this really challenging period, which hopefully is just a few months. But, with revenues dropping to, 80% declines, in some instances, 100%, it's really critical that the government understands how dire the situation is for small businesses across Canada. And so that comparison of what all the other countries are doing versus what Canada's doing, it was very clear that the Canadian government and provinces working together need to step it up. They need to offer additional support, particularly around rent at this time.
Yeah, no, that's great. Because in the experience that I've had with disasters, I'm a huge fan of grants because what I see, these programs are always, launched by different levels of government, and they're all loans. And small businesses right now taking on more debt, if that's their only option, I'm not sure that's a really good option. So looking at other ways and levers you can pull, like rent and, any subsidies, any kind of expenses that you can defer or lessen, that's what small businesses need.
Yeah, and what we were really getting in the research that we put out a survey, and the results was really suggesting that without additional support, up to 70% of the businesses we surveyed would not be able to make rent by May 1st. So we're approaching that as a critical point, and ultimately the federal government has tried to take the lead. They've taken many of the recommendations that Save Small Business and other groups have offered that are part of the policies in Australia, which has a similar jurisdictional framework, so federal government and provinces. And really what we need to see as we work in this sort of final stretch of approaching May 1st is we need all of the Canadian provinces and territories to ultimately sign on and help implement the program that the Canadian federal government has put forward, which is a good offer. It would work reasonably well for both landlords and tenants that really are all small businesses struggling through this together. And so really, for us, it's always been about how do we share the burden? How do we work together with different organizations, with different levels of governments, and making it easy and friendly for landlords and tenants to have an agreed upon framework that does work for everybody.
Yeah. And I know in the US with FEMA, they talk a lot about the whole of society approach, and that's what we need to adopt here. It's everybody. I mean, we're all in this together. It's going to take some things we're negotiating, some things we have to give up, and other things we need support on. So, I mean, I think what you guys are doing is great. I hope that you're successful in bringing more attention to the dire needs of businesses, because the small ones, and we know, I don't know what the stat is, it's something like 90% of Canadian businesses are small businesses. They're not big corporations. They don't have big pockets. So they need support.
Yeah, the findings around, most small businesses only have 2 to 4 weeks of cash on hand. So that's when the drop in revenue was so significant so quickly. It left most small businesses struggling to pay rent April 1. Really, that number growing significantly as May 1 approaches. And so really, the question we have is, what's standing in the way of provinces supporting this, and ultimately they're responsible from a jurisdictional standpoint in addressing the implementation, because similar to commercial or residential issues, rent is controlled by the provinces. So for example, to issue a moratorium on commercial rent evictions, that's something that the provinces across Canada should be doing today. And by May 1st, having the details worked out so that the federal government can foot the bill, but ultimately have it work so that provinces, landlords, and tenants have the agreement in place that we can get through this and have that sort of runway of at least the next few months. The initial agreement was April, May, and June, because revenues are not going to bounce back overnight. We're looking at a gradual reopening of the economy. And so, it could be many months still before the relatively tight margins and the cash flow increases that most small businesses that, are paying 5 or 10 or 15,000 in rent for their Main Street shops across Canada are in a position to fully pay rent on their own. And the reason why loans don't work is because many small businesses already have debt. Some don't qualify for the government programs that have been announced previously. Many don't have payroll or use dividends or some combination of those. So, we've just continued to try to share what's it look like on the ground for most small businesses across the country. And we are getting a good response from the federal government. We've been calling on the provinces to join us and step up and contribute to the solutions that are needed at this time.
Well, that's awesome. I will share in the video description below how to get in touch with your organization to support you, to find out what's going on. Thanks again, Michael, for all you're doing to help put this issue on the federal agenda. And I know that the work you're doing will have huge dividends. So thank you very much. And thanks for taking the time to talk to me today.
My pleasure, Leanne. Thank you.